should be fun. I love talking GM stuff, so this is more pleasure than pain. But for those of you who missed it, my name is Luzelli. You probably see me on the server, or maybe you haven't. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But let's get into it with my caveat that I gave some of the others who were here earlier. To begin with, combat is a very expansive topic for any RPG. There is lots of tricks that are universal to RPGs in general. And of course, there are lots of tricks that are very specific to the game type or the game system that you're playing, right? So what's the point of me doing this? Well, if I do my job right, hopefully you guys will have a set of tools that I hope are universal across multiple RPG systems for you. To that end, my intent is to not give you like a foolproof formula that's like, oh, you need X number of minions divided by Y number of PCs or some such garbage, right? If anybody ever tells you that's how this game works, they're fucking lying to you, because this game is a lot more open to GM fiat, which, depending on your point of view, is either a bug or a feature, right? I prefer it. I like it. So from that end, I like that it's very open, but that also means that there aren't a lot of like hard number guidelines to really help you go prepare your combats, right? Which is a blessing and a curse, right? At the end of the day, the best I can do is tell you some things that I think are cool, that I think are worthwhile of looking into, but it comes down to practice. You just have to run a bunch of combats and you have to suck at them for a little while until you figure out your stride, right? And you know what you want to do. But to that end, for me, the thing I see often, and that I think when people ask a question or something like that, that they often really are neglecting, are two pillars of combat. One is what is at stake in the combat. More often than not, people kind of forget that that's a thing that can be very much changed, and a small little adjustment in that is going to do wonders for why your PCs care, and making the entire experience go from just a murder in an alleyway to like something that really grabs your players. The other is the environments that you choose to fight in. Some of this is a little difficult. It depends on the kind of game that you're running. If you're running a very linear game, you'll have much greater control over the environments that you put your players in when they're going to get into a combat. If you're running a more open sandbox, whatever term you want to use, you will have slightly less control, but hopefully I will be able to give you a couple tools that will still help you along with the whole process, right? So I broke this down into combat in general into two large categories: objectives and opposition, right? In my opinion, these are the two main pieces of any combat. Objectives is fairly obvious. It's what your PCs are trying to do, right? And the opposition is anything that is impeding your PC's progress. This includes NPCs and the environment and, you know, their obligation, whatever coming into play, anything that is impeding their progress, right? So let's dig into these a little bit. Objectives, right? In my opinion, the majority of combats, their primary problem is that there is no great objective. More often than not, we're used to thinking about killing our way to glory. It's a thing. It's fine. You know, like if we weren't being able to do that, it would be kind of boring to be playing Star Wars if we weren't actually fighting people in a war of sorts, right? But because, you know, fighting your way through the opposition, killing them is so ubiquitous, I don't think that it makes for a good objective as a standalone. In fact, the way I would rather approach it, and I think is better to approach it, is to consider killing as the default objective. It's a thing that's embedded in almost any situation. They can, at any opportunity, pull out their weapons and try and murder their way through whatever is stopping them, which could be like a bartender giving them lip, or it could be 30 stormtroopers, right? It doesn't really matter. That is always an option on the table. And since it is always an option, I don't think it makes for a great objective. It can be, but I think if you want to actually make combats that feel cinematic and entertaining and exciting, you need something more than just their skin, right? These are, after all, heroes. So, or, I don't know, infamous villains, whatever. In either event, though, simply killing is a little redundant. So I think we can do better. And in order to do better, we kind of need to figure out what makes a good objective, right? So I broke down objectives into two primary components. A strong objective is composed of something that has consequence and choice. I define consequence as the objective can be failed without utterly derailing and destroying the game. However, whether win, lose, or draw, the narrative is always substantially altered, right? So the point is that no matter what happens, by engaging in this encounter, the narrative has to change, right? If the objective can be ignored and nothing changes because of it, it's not a terribly strong objective. That doesn't make it not an objective. It just makes it a kind of weak objective that you have, right? But to that end, if we're talking about an objective that can substantially alter the narrative, we also have to talk about the choice embedded into the narrative, because just because it can change the narrative doesn't still make it a good objective. It also has to have meaning for the player characters that are involved with it, right? An easy example would be like if you have a pack of murder hobos, right? As much as they are taboo in RPG lexicon, you need to have something that they care about. If you put a bunch of hostages and they do not give a damn, you might as well not have made that a part of your objective set, right? Because like they're just going to rip right by them. It doesn't matter. You need to, your job as a GM is to find something that they do care about, right? So that's the other element of a good, strong objective is choice. And it's choice that matters to the player characters in question. And also they have to be distinct choices that actually do force them to pick between one or the other option. A classic example of a bad objective, even though it sounds like a good one, is your save the hostages or kill the bad guys scenario, right? In the void, it sounds fine, right? But if you really think about it, in most of the situations where this is employed, if you kill the bad guys, you've saved the hostages. And in order to save the hostages, more often than not, you have to kill the bad guys, right? So in order to give this kind of an objective some real consequence and real choice embedded into the objective, what you really have to answer is, what do the players have to give up in order to save the hostages? What are they going to gain by choosing to ignore the hostages and hunt down the opposition, right? If you don't have a clear answer to that, and if the players can't see that there is a clear difference between the two choices, it doesn't matter. This whole scenario kind of falls apart, because as far as they can tell, they might as well just kill the dudes and they'll still do what they need to do, right? So a better way to formulate the same scenario of save the hostages or kill the opposition would be get the hostages out of the burning building and let the opposition escape, or hunt down the opposition, capture their VIP, and ignore the hostages, right? So we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper, right? You have that first one of get the hostages out of the burning building and let the opposition escape. The consequence in here is, I suppose, somewhat obvious, but I'm just going to go through it anyway, is you save some hostages if you win, right? If you follow this objective to completion, you save some innocents, and you might gain some fame, you might gain some local support, you know, all the things of being lauded as a hero come your way because, you know, you saved a bunch of innocent people. But in order for this to have choice, or meaning, I should say, in order for this to have real consequence, the implicit understanding is that if you just focus on saving the hostages, you do give the bad guys a chance to run away, right? That's fine. The alternative to this is if they choose to try and save the hostages, but they fail, too many of the hostages die, or maybe all of them die, I don't know, and they lose sight of the bad guys. They get mischaracterized, they get charged with something, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the point is this. Breaking it down into those two win-fail conditions, you can see how the story can change, right? In one version, they are heroes, and because they are heroes, they get local support, and because they have local support, maybe some police chief or something comes up to him and is like, hey guys, you've proven that you're capable. I can't go to anybody in the department with this, but maybe you can take a look at it, right? You've built a way for the story to continue. You've built maybe possible connections for them. In the other version where they fail everything, the story doesn't just grind to a halt, because then it's a terrible objective because nothing was moved on. Instead, they have this weird infamy about them, right? They are considered evil or something like that, or maybe just hardcore as hell. And they might be approached by the criminal element, or they might be hunted by the opposition and not have help from the local populace. So you change the game from a bunch of good guys hunting down bad guys to good guys in a survival type story where they're surrounded by people who don't trust them and they're also being hunted by bad guys, right? The point being, the reason an objective works in this case is because no matter the outcome, there's consequence to their choice. Whether or not they chose to go after the hostages and whether or not they succeed matters. It changes the way the story is going to go from here on out. But like I said, choice is the other important element. You can't just have consequence of like, okay, so if they take this option, they'll save hostages. If they take this option, they'll hunt down bad guys. The actual choice between the two has to matter, right? Like we said, the option to save the hostages is good for anybody who wants to live the hero life, right? The alternative for this particular example I have is that they choose to hunt down the bad guys and thereby capture a high value target, which gives them information, other ways to move on the plot, that kind of thing. And there is a third set of choices here, which is that they could try and do both at the same time. They could break the team off into, two players go after the bad guys, two players try and deal with the hostages, which is fine. But the implicit choice there is that they have less firepower to put towards both objectives, and that opens them up to being, very badly hurt, right? Like they don't have the full team's resources. All this having been said, the way this can be utterly meaningless is A, if they're murder hobos, that wasn't a choice. You knew which way they were going to go. B, if they're paladin-like Jedis, that's also not a choice. They're always going to save the hostages because they're a paladin, right? So in this case, even though on the face of it, it looks like, oh, there was a meaningful choice here, there wasn't, because that paladin Jedi, they're not going to think twice. They're going to jump right into saving the hostages. So the other aspect of this is you do need to know the kind of characters that you have in your game, right? In order to evaluate a choice and to figure out if it is meaningful and therefore makes this objective meaningful and useful, you definitely always have to tailor it to the players at your table. Just as a overall, right? Like I said, one of the things you want to take care of when creating your combat scenarios are your objectives. Just remember that fighting and killing them is default. Even if you don't think about it, your players are definitely sizing them up, thinking about murdering them, right? They're always going to probably take a quick look and see if they can rip through them and thereby end the conflict, right? So if you're not doing that, if we're not making killing our default objective, the thing you want to consider is what meaningful choices can I present to these player characters that will impact the narrative depending on what they choose. And if one of those choices would utterly derail or destroy the game, do make sure you steer away from that because that's probably not what you want, right? You want to make sure that these consequences can be won or failed and the game can still continue, right? It's okay if they're behind a few steps, but if it just completely obliterates them, you probably want to take a harder look at what you're doing, unless this is like, I don't know, a big narrative moment in your game, and then yeah, all bets are off. Maybe things go terribly bad. But to help you, here are some very broad categories of non-murderous objectives, right? This is just to help you kind of organize your thoughts as you're sitting there thinking like, okay, I have this thing that's going to happen, but what other objective could I put into place? You could have them save a thing. Hostages, save a prototype vehicle, save a VIP, escort somebody to a place, defend a base, right? Another objective, a standard one, is take a thing. Extract the VIP, steal the plans, steal some pretty gadgets, steal the prototype vehicle, and lastly, implant a thing. This is one of the weirder ones insofar as it is for everything such as putting putting evidence of framing somebody for murder by hiding evidence in their house, as it could be like trying to gather a rebel cell against the Empire, right? Or trying to hack into the HoloNet feeds to run some sort of a news article a la Firefly, something like that. All to say, those three large categories should help kind of organize you when you're thinking about, okay, other than killing, what other objectives can I put into place? So we talked about objectives, right? That's the one thing that we want to make sure we have locked down when we're thinking about a combat scenario that we're going to do. The next thing is obviously the opposition, right? What is trying to stop the PCs from doing whatever it is that they want to do? The easiest, most obvious one is going to be NPCs, right? What are they? What are the NPCs that are relevant or important to this particular situation? Imps, droids, creatures, pirates, enemy ships, whatever, right? The other one that people do think about, but never, in my opinion, give enough time to is the environment, right? And the environment, it seems simple, but it has a few subtle, tricky parts that I think you can leverage that will make your fight a lot better, right? The first thing you want to think about when you're thinking about the environment is the actual geography, right? What is the physical layout of this space, right? People usually will say something like, we are inside a Star Destroyer. Okay, cool. It's a Star Destroyer. Generally speaking, those are long rectangular corridors. Fine. You have a sense of the geography. If I was you, I would maybe narrow it down to a particular sector of the Star Destroyer, maybe pick like some sort of engineering room so you have something different to work with, whatever. Doesn't matter, but you do need to just have a clear picture of the basic layout of the place, right? Once you know the basic layout, you can see it in your head. That's when you want to look into the second aspect of the environment, which in my opinion is the more fun aspect, which are the features of that physical space. What unique things happen to be there, right? So as an example, let's say you want this fight to go down in a crowded carnival, right? The geography for this is probably fairly easy, right? It's if you've ever been to a state fair or a carnival or something like that, it's probably like a large circle or a large square type shape, right? But the other interesting aspects of that geography is what are the location of rides? What are the location of attractions? What are the location of arcades? What's the location of the food court type area, right? In addition to thinking about where these different types of things might be, you also want to think about, well, this game is very much into vertical space. So what is above ground elevation and what is below ground elevation? If there are rides, are they roller coaster rides? If they are roller coaster rides, come up with 2 or 3 that seem interesting. You don't have to know everything about them right now. All you need to know is there are 2 or 3 higher elevations. What are those higher elevations? They're roller coaster rides, right? And the catwalks and girders and whatever the hell else that make up those roller coasters. Now, like I said, that's just basic geography. If we zoom into the features of that space, this is where you start actually populating details, right? We know that the arcades are located in the west sector of the carnival. Now we decide if that place is super packed. Maybe this carnival is known for its crazy arcades, right? So that place is incredibly packed. That's where you're going to see the most kids, right? All trying to win all sorts of prizes. And you can delve into what kind of arcades there are. On the other side, the east side, is where there are rides and stuff like that. Straight to the north is the Tunnel of Love and other places for young lovers, that sort of thing, right? So you've got the physical layout, you know where things are, you know where your elevation points are, that kind of thing. And now you populate it with interesting little tidbits, things that when you describe to the players, they will be able to see the space better. And you'll be able to see the space better, but most importantly, you've given your fight some dynamic context. All of these things that you are jotting down in very short snippets, they are going to be what you leverage to make the fight cooler, right? So, like we said, the geography of a fight is the actual shape of the terrain, right? It doesn't matter what it is, you just want to get a rough sketch of it, right? It could be a large square, it could be 3 ellipsoid segments of land that are floating on repulsors, a long trench broken by flows of magma, whatever, right? Once you have that general shape in mind, the next thing you want to look at is where are the highlights, right? Where are those little landmarks that we talked about? The place where the crowd is the most dense, the place where the kids are mostly doing whatever, the place where the most attractive roller coaster is in the ride, that kind of thing. The place where superheated steam jets vent out superheated gas, right? Who knows? But you need to pick some spots for them and figure out where they are. The last bit that I want you to think about is verticality, which really is just a subset of the geography, the shape of the terrain, right? But the only reason I have kind of emphasized it is because people tend to very much forget to think in 3 dimensions, above and below, right? So whenever you are thinking about a space, think about what could be above it, what could be below it, and how they can access those areas, right? There is something to be said for making it difficult to access the upper and lower elevations of a fight. But there's also, I would suggest the opposite, just to try it, just to see how it feels, is make it super easy to flow between the higher and lower elevations and see how that changes your fight. One thing that I noticed is if I didn't make it too terribly difficult to change elevations, players are far more likely to use them with a little bit of help from me. So that's a little side note. But once we have those geographic features in place, the next thing you want to do is look at those features. Features, by the way, these are all just my terms so that we can have an intelligent discussion. I don't know that any of this is set out anywhere else, but these are just the terms that I'm using. So to me, features are really just those highlights that you figured out before, but they have slightly more value, right? So in a very broad sense, features are all the non-combatant peoples, droids, whatever, that populate a space, right? And they are the bizarre terrain aspects that make traversing the space interesting. And they're also the terrain aspects that are dangerous, but not necessarily directly antagonistic or entirely hostile to the PCs. So to try and kind of explain what I mean here, the core point that you want is a feature is an aspect of the environment that you can leverage game mechanics on top of. That's what makes it different from a highlight, in my opinion. So a highlight, like we said, is maybe where the crowd is dense. But if you want to turn that highlight into a feature, what you would do is you would say, okay, the crowd is super dense over by the arcades to the left, to the west side of this carnival. In fact, it's so dense that if you want to move through it, you guys, it's considered difficult terrain, right? You can make an argument and say that before you even assign it those difficult terrain categories or whatever, a player could see the crowd and be like, oh, I'm going to try and hide amongst all these people, which, you know, it'd be reasonable to give them a boost or an upgrade for, which is a mechanic. However, that the distinction here is that you presented something and basically said, hey, player, here's a toy if you can figure out how to use it. And they did figure it out. And so you give them the boost or the upgrade for using it. Whereas if you were treating it as a feature, you're saying, hey, player, here's a toy, and it has a very discrete mechanic attached to it, right? So they can still do the hide in the crowd thing and get a boost or an upgrade. That's all fine and well. But you're also saying, hey, this crowd also is considered difficult terrain because of how dense it is. And that, in the context of a fight, is going to elevate your fight because now you've created zones where players know that there are mechanics attached to them. They know what those mechanics are, and you're allowing them the ability to use or honestly forget that they exist, right? So just as a matter of implementation, if you're doing this in person or if you're doing it with a virtual board, one thing you might consider is just put out like a little notepad that says dense crowd, difficult terrain, right? Let them know there's no purpose in hiding this. Like some things you may want to hide, but things like this, you probably want to leave open so they can see, okay, this is happening. This is what it does to me. Now, how do I figure out how I can use it or how I can avoid it, right? So to take an example that most everybody would probably be very familiar with is like lava pits, right? That's a pretty standard environmental hazard. And what makes it a good feature is when both the PCs and the NPCs can be harmed or helped by it, right? It's not antagonistic to any one group. So for example, some weirdo who is able to weaponize the lava and shoot it just at the PCs but miss all the NPCs, that's not a good feature. That's not an environmental hazard. That's really more an aspect of the NPC. They can, for whatever reason, control lava and throw it at the players. So it's really just another aspect of them. To be a good terrain feature, it needs to be kind of a neutral danger that exists or a neutral entity that exists in the space of the combat. It can work for or against you, but it's up to the players and the NPCs to figure out how to use these environmental features to their advantage, right? So like I was saying with the lava pit, the reason it makes for a good example is because players don't need to be told how much damage it's going to do or anything like that. It is incredibly intuitive. They understand that if they get shoved in there, that's going to hurt. Likewise, they also understand, you know, I could probably push an NPC into it, right? So the fact that it's usable both for and against them is what makes a good feature. That's most of what we have on environments and stuff. The next part that I said I wasn't going to talk about, but I lied because I'm going to talk a little bit about it, is NPCs themselves, right? Like I said, I can't give you any good formulas because I don't think they really exist. It very much depends on the group that you have in play. How many minions makes a good amount of minions versus too many minions, that kind of thing. But there are some ways you can approach this problem of like, I don't know how many bad guys to send up against my players that don't require formulas or something like that, right? And I guess this is where I have to lay out my bias. I don't particularly like quote unquote balanced combats. I don't think that's terribly fun for me, but I will try and present a way to do combat as both balanced and also another way where you just kind of do whatever makes fictional sense, right? So let's take a look at what I recommend, honestly, for a newer GM is to go for attempting to balance combats, right? That which I call method one. The idea here is you're not trying to overwhelm your players. You're trying to come up with something exciting and interesting. You want to throw some cool NPCs at them, but you also want to let them, you want them to be able to win the fight. You just don't want it to be a gimme fight, and you also don't want it to be brutally punishing, right? So in order to do that, and honestly, in order to deal with any NPCs for any combat, there are three questions you must answer. One, what kind of NPCs make sense for this combat, right? No matter which methodology you use, to suddenly have a Rancor show up out of nowhere is a dick move, makes no sense, and it's just going to be bizarre. There are certain games where that makes sense, where that is actually cool, and more power to you, but I'm going to take the tack that the average on the whole, most people want to have a less tongue-in-cheek kind of experience, right? So you would want consistent adversaries based on where you are. So for one, you want to figure out what kind of NPCs make sense for this combat. That's not just simply identifying if it should be Imperials or pirates or creatures or Inquisitors. It's also, you need to give some sort of justification to yourself why they make sense for this combat, right? Why are they in this space? Why are they the good NPC to throw at them? The next question you want to answer is, if you had to, what kind of reinforcements can these guys call, right? In some cases, the answer may be none. They might be there entirely on their own, and that's fine. But, for yourself, you want to figure out if they need to call reinforcements, what kind of reinforcements can they call? And again, why, right? You're building in narrative reasoning for why these things are happening. And last but not least, you want to figure out also what else could draw them away from the fight. What you're doing with answering these questions really is setting yourself up for ways to add to the fight or take away from the fight without overwhelming the players, without making it terribly obvious that you're manipulating it this way. You're basically giving yourself an out. You're preparing narrative prompts that you're going to use to justify some mechanical bullshit that you're going to do in a minute here, right? So, like I said, third question, of course, is what else is happening that can draw the enemy away? You got to find something, because the premise here is that you're not terribly confident with your combat building skills. So always give yourself a way to make the combat more intense by virtue of adding more enemies, and also to diminish it by taking away enemies, right? Give yourself the permission to do that, because that will make things a lot easier. So now that you've got this structure built off those three questions, the generic advice that I can give you is to always start small, right? As a GM, especially in this system, there's so much latitude for GM fiat. You can always throw in more enemies as long as you have a good reason for why and you know what, right? So don't stress too much. It's okay if you threw in, I don't know, maybe a squad of 4 minions and your players just shredded them apart in almost a round or two, right? You got destiny points, you got general GM fuckery. You can do whatever you like to throw in some more, right? That's not a big deal. So start small enough that you think will present a challenge, right? The obvious answer is sometimes people will very much overestimate their PC's abilities, and they'll be like, no, these guys can handle 2 squads of 5 minions apiece. no problem, and they get around into it, and it looks really terribly bad. It could be for any number of reasons. You could have just misunderstood what your players are capable of, or it could have just been very unlucky dice, right? This is where you have that other narrative prompt of what can be caused to take them away, right? So when you sense that the fight is getting way too dangerous, you want to make sure that you have ways to pull enemies away. You have things that can happen to pull them out, right? All this doesn't really help you unless you have a general frame for combat. In my opinion, the combat in this game works best if it lasts 3 to 5 rounds. I would say 5 is kind of the upper limit. So for a standard combat, you want to go about 3 rounds. If it's starting to drag longer, you might want to look into getting rid of the opposition early. If it looks like it's going to end before that 3-round mark, maybe toss in a few other guys or some sort of complication just to lengthen it out just a little bit. But that's kind of just some general guidelines that might help. They're very generic. I can't attest to them working every time, but hopefully they'll at least get you started. Okay, so this is the second method. Like I said, my bias, the method that I prefer. And the core tenets of this method, I guess I'm just going to read this one because it is very important to understand so that you can make sense of everything else that happens, which is this: fairness, balance, appropriate, challenge. All this is bullshit. They are a myth and they are meaningless, right? Because you, if you are using this method, have decided that the world is the world. It's going to do what it's going to do, but the players are going to get in there and they're going to mix shit up because they're heroes, and they will be a gigantic nexus of chaos and probability. To that end, you don't need to invent chaos. They are your chaotic elements. You need to invent a structure that is very logically coherent and narratively consistent, right? And so to use this method, you must make peace with the fact that if the players inadvertently fall into a challenge that is beyond them, such as life, and they're going to need to make a way out of it, right? Or you're going to need to help them find their way out of it, because the opposition is the opposition. If they are fighting, if you tell them that there's an Imperial base and they decide to try and storm the base, they should expect somewhere between 50 to 100 stormtroopers. And if they're surprised, you should be like, come on, guys, what do you think was going to happen, right? Likewise, if they're going to fight in an alleyway, there should only ever be 4 or 5 thugs, right? And if there are players that can take on 50 stormtroopers at once, you should expect them to laugh in the face of these thugs and maybe obliterate them in less than a round, right? That's a core tenet of this. Is there still can be reasons for NPCs to get spawned in or to get removed, but you're doing it for entirely different reasons beyond fairness, balance, or like, oh, the party is taking too many hits, that kind of stuff, right? Which is kind of my attempt to answer the question of like why this method does not devolve into rocks fall, everyone dies, because it can if you are not treating this fairly and with a degree of caution. You can easily overwhelm them because you as the GM have perfect knowledge of everything. You are God for all intents and purposes. So you know all the different ways in and out of the fight and all the different ways to mitigate the fight. They don't. They're working with imperfect knowledge, right? So if you do not mitigate that gap, this will be incredibly unfair and incredibly unfun, right? So how do you mitigate that gap? Well, there's really only one thing, and that is to telegraph. You must telegraph everything and anything that is pertinent to the situation, right? Because in order for this method to work, the PCs have to be able to look at something like an Imperial base and have an intuitive sense of like, oh, this is a X size base, so it's probably got about 20 stormtroopers at any given time, plus a handful of personnel. Oh, this is a much larger base. It's probably got about 50 stormtroopers, plus maybe 20 of just, worker bee personnel at any given time. They need to be able to make those kinds of assessments. In order for them to make those kinds of assessments, you need to find a way to make everyone's expectations align. And that is not an easy task at all, right? One of the hardest things in role playing is making the players see things that you're seeing in your head. That's what most of these tools and tips and tricks are about, is to get everybody on the same page. So in order to accomplish this, you must telegraph, right? You need to find ways to let them know things, find ways to give them knowledge that they can piece together so that when they look at a situation, they have ways to read it and understand how dangerous it is, what our escape options are, and what are, how we can engage the fight, that sort of thing. As an example, if you know that the Imperials have a secret station nearby and the players do not, when they're in the middle of doing whatever shenanigans and a band of Imperials show up, they will call foul play. And that's the thing that you need to mitigate. You need to do enough to telegraph that there are Imperials nearby. You don't need to necessarily let them know there's a secret Imperial station. But the thing that they must understand is that for whatever reason, whatever is happening in this particular space, for whatever reason, Imperials are around in greater force than they would expect, so that they as players can intuit. And if they don't intuit, just fucking break fiction for a moment and let them know, like, hey, you guys have seen this. Your characters, if you didn't understand, your characters should understand that, like, for whatever reason, there's a lot more Imperials. If you start, getting into a loud fight, that might draw Imperial attention, right? So just make sure that that fact is understood, right? In my opinion, uh, one of that, while telegraphing is a major must for this, and that imperfect alignment of expectations is a big problem, I do think it does create a side benefit, which is that it tends to ratchet up tension. Because if you're doing this properly, you're telegraphing so much that they can see all these things that don't necessarily make sense that start to freak them out, so that when they actually engage in something, they should be in a heightened state of tension when things go down, right? And that's the other thing about telegraphing that is important in this particular methodology, is you need to help them understand what their options for engaging in the fight and escaping from the fight are, right? In a more linear game where they don't have a choice in the matter with something like this, the temptation is to just say, oh no, they'll sort it out. They can see that, like, if they take them from the ground, they might have to worry about the guys perched up high. It's probably better for them to make like an assault from a building opposite or something. There's some things that you can take a little bit of leeway with. But if you're using this method, you do need to be a bit more mother henish, I guess. And let them know that, like, hey guys, these are the ways that you can engage. You don't have to do this every time, but especially if this method is new to you and your players, everybody needs some time to, like, kind of get up to gear with it, right? So it's okay to break fiction for a moment and just be like, hey, here's some ways that you can engage with this that the players didn't notice, but your characters probably would, right? Because you're trying to get them into the habit of thinking of this as all logically consistent narrative fiction, so that they break, to some extent, they break some bad habits of, like, oh, I can just run in and that'll be totally fine. Whereas you want them to think about other ways to approach an objective, right? To approach an engagement, that sort of thing. Likewise, also make sure you highlight their avenues of escape. If they're going to get into this fight, make sure they understand what ways they can get out of the fight, right? And with all this breaking of fiction and all sorts of stuff like that, you're gonna the obvious question is, how the hell do you make this cinematic, right? Because if it's a bunch of murderously capable players versus some dumbass thugs in an alleyway, how in the hell is that going to be remotely interesting? Right? That's a very good question. And in fact, that is why I used it as my super bad example. And I do want to throw out the caveat, like, I chose as bad an example as I could for two reasons. One, to show you how you can make it better. Two, to show that a combat is only as good as your inspiration, right? Like, this alleyway fight is never going to be grand epic. It can get better, but it is somewhat limited to its uninspired nature. Right? So here is the posited scenario. You got 4 PCs that arrive on planet, and you got some NPC thugs that incorrectly mark them as a target to be mugged, hustled, something like that, right? So NPC rolls up on them and is like, hey guys, you looking for some wares? I got a lot of primo gear, even some that DMs don't know about. You in? And of course, the PC is looking at this weirdo, because they're used to dealing with weirdos, partially because they're weirdos themselves. They're like, yeah, sure, why not? So they follow the NPC into town. He chats him up along the way, trying to be a good grifter, right? Leads him into the alleyway where his other buddies are waiting, and they cut off both ends of the alleyway. NPC turns to the PCs and says, well, you know the drill, fellas. You're cashing your gears, what I expect, or my boys here are going to want a conversation. And that's when the fight starts. So this is a truly wretched combat example, right? You may ask why. I will tell you why. There are more reasons, but these are the ones that stand out as most egregious to me. The geography of this fight is trash. It is just an alleyway, right? Right now, as we've presented it, there's nothing really to set it apart. It's effectively a long featureless corridor, right? Secondly, we have our opposition. They are 5 NPC thugs. In the Edge core book, thugs are one of the most garbage minion types that you can have, right? Nothing terribly interesting about them. They're just hustlers, street thugs, that sort of thing, right? Third, the objective is pretty much trash. It's these guys mugging the PCs. So the objective is to escape or kill the NPCs. But as we've talked about before, to escape them, you probably have to kill them. And if you kill them, you escape the predicament. So it's effectively the same thing. Maybe some PCs could just straight outrun the whole conflict. Sure, that's a thing that could happen. But in either event, largely uninspired, right? And as we talked about in the example, I think I mentioned that these thugs have incorrectly categorized the PCs as an easy mark. That was me trying to say that like our 4 PCs in this example far outclass the 5 thugs that we're using for the example, right? So we're pretty certain that our PCs are going to rip right through these guys. Now, if you're using method 1, we're going to talk about how you can take still the same setup and gain a little bit of system familiarity and, you know, build onto this encounter. But in the context of method 2, which is about presenting the world as it is, there's no reason for an alleyway mugging to have like 30 guys, right? You could contrive a reason, yes, but on the face of it, PCs getting mugged in an alleyway, they should probably expect 4 to 5 thugs, right? Looking at these dudes, they should understand they're like street thugs, you know? They're not like hardened warriors who have traveled planets and toppled organizations, right? They're probably relatively weak combatants. So using method 2, again, it seems that we are locked into these 5 thugs and there's not a whole lot that we can do here. But as we rework this scenario, hopefully you guys can see how we can follow either method and still make this an interesting fight, regardless of how good our PCs are or how combat capable. So first things first, what I prefer to do is to start with the environment. You don't have to follow this strict order. To me, it just makes more sense. To me, I need to see the combat space, start building it out like a puzzle piece, and then I can start adding other elements to it. So for me, first thing I do is I check the geography, right? The fight scene is an alleyway. We're going to stick to that, but we're going to try and give it some character. First things first, alleyway. That implies a good degree of verticality, right? There's fire escapes, maybe some metal catwalks and things like that, to make it very pertinent. And this is a thing I do suggest with to make all of the verticality of your fights more apparent and interesting, is plant some NPCs in those vertical spaces, right? It's cool to let the players know that there are fire escapes, but it becomes combat relevant when there are 2 NPCs parked in like parked on those fire escapes, like maybe a medium range away from them with pistols, right? Now, it's not just like, oh, there's a place that we can get to. There is a threat up there, right? There's a reason to go up into that vertical space and start playing around. Last but not least, of course, we can add some highlights. An alleyway doesn't give us a whole lot, but we can work with this. For one, if it's an alleyway, there's probably dumpsters full of refuse, right? Some bags of trash, whatever, things like that. For me, I think it's very funny to have a broken speeder on cinder blocks somewhere in there, right? But okay, those are cool. If you're really thinking about it, those at best provide a bit of cover. And maybe if you have a mechanic on hand, they might be able to do some mechanical wizardry to make that broken speeder explode or some nonsense, right? They might be able to pull some of that kind of nonsense with it. Not a whole lot, so we should probably add some more. One thing I think would be interesting is an alleyway. That doesn't mean there can't be doors to other places, so add a door, right? And what I think would be interesting is just a door that leads to blank nothingness doesn't help you. In this case, we're going to put a door that leads to the kitchens of a restaurant that they passed on the way to there, right? So how do you highlight that it's leading to the kitchen of the same restaurant that they just passed? Make sure that they can smell the cooking, the cooking spices from the closed door. They can hear, the chefs and the people in there chopping vegetables and talking and laughing and whatever, right? Now, I categorize this as a feature, even though I did not present it with specific explicit mechanics, right? Largely because it has what I call soft mechanics or implicit mechanics, which is there's a door, right? first and foremost, a PC could run in, kick that door open, and use it to separate them from bad guys. That's always good, right? We've already described that it's an active kitchen. There are people in there. There are things in there being used. So any of the nonsense you could find in the kitchen would be useful here, and any of that nonsense should be prevalent and present, right? Last but not least, the people in there are also weaponizable to some extent. Depends on your PCs. But the point is that this door with the smell of cooking spices that is obviously to a kitchen, it doesn't need explicit mechanics because what it is tells you that there's a lot of different ways that it can be used. You don't need to list them all out, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But you do need to have them in mind. You do need to at least work out how it can be used somewhat. Don't work out every instance of how it can be used for two reasons. One, the PCs will always come up with something you can't think of. Two, because if you do try and lock in every usage of it, you may not be receptive to some bizarre idea that they have, right? So I just say pick a few things that are useful, right? You don't have to get too in depth with it. And last but not least, this is kind of looking ahead. I'm going to add another highlight here, which we're going to use for the objectives section, which is that the streets and the alleyways up to this point have been spray painted with the tag for the calf hounds, right? So far, we've basically just taken a minute to fix up the environment so that when you describe it to the players, you have some shit to say. And not only do you have things to say, but they are weaponizable. They're usable by your players. They can leverage them to some extent just as much as the NPCs, right? And to explicitly illustrate that, we have put some NPCs in the higher vertical space to show that, hey, they're starting to use this stuff against you, right? So that's the environment. We're pretty good with that. We could maybe dig into it even more, but that's good enough for now. Next would be fixing the opposition that they are facing, right? And like I said, we have our two methods. The one is we're going to stick with the first one to begin with. First of all, Aqualish thugs are the minions that I was thinking of when I wrote this up. You can find them, the stats if you're curious, in the core rulebook for Edge, page 391. I think they appear lots of other books, but if you're curious, that's where they are. Now, the first method, like I said, is really for people who don't feel combat confident, right? If you're not confident in building an engaging encounter, do this because it at least gives you a framework to work with, right? And then over time, ideally, you'll build system mastery and you can not have to think about it so rigidly in the future. So to begin with, what are NPCs? There are 5 Aqualish thugs. In the course of describing this whole thing, I think I laid a few things out, but let's make it explicit. They are a local stick-up crew, right? They just find a couple marks, they mug them, take their stuff, and run, right? Nothing too connected. Just some dumb guys who made a mistake today. That's kind of the theme we're going with. So since they are a local stick-up crew, what kind of reinforcements do they have? They're not much. We already decided that they're not terribly connected. So at best, maybe another squad of 4 Aqualishes, maybe a squad of 5. Doesn't really matter. What I would say doesn't fit them would be 2 squads of a total of 10 Aqualishes, right? These guys are small time. I think at best, they are 10 members strong. So that's what we're going to go with. So in a pinch, they can get 4 other Aqualish thugs into the mix. How they do that, we'll get into that later. But that's the kind of reinforcements they have at play. Last but not least, how can you draw them away? If, for whatever reason, this first crew of 5 Aqualish thugs, or maybe even when you add the second crew of 4 Aqualish, suddenly becomes too much, how can you draw the numbers away from this encounter, bring it down, or bring it to a quicker resolution, right? We could invent something new, but why not use all the parts of the buffalo? We just invented that there's a restaurant next door. It seems very logical that if there is gunfire happening outside your door, they would call the cops, right? Again, these guys are not terribly connected. I don't think they would be interested in the idea of paying off a bunch of cops or dealing with a gunfight on the streets, that kind of thing. So yeah, probably just somebody calling the cops and then the cops showing up in a somewhat timely fashion, which for you as a GM is great. You can have them come up whenever is narratively appropriate, right? Like the sirens in the background, that sort of thing, as the first indication. So yeah, that's the way to get rid of them if you need to. The purpose of doing this legwork is, one, it is applicable to both methods. Two, you're trying to build system mastery, right? Because you don't know how many thugs your PCs can take on. You don't know how many minions plus rivals your PCs can take on. And even if you do know how many minions plus rivals, there's no guarantee that this mixture of minions plus rivals is the one that they're going to have a super hard time with, right? The game is not really built that way. Over time, you will develop system mastery, but until you do, you need to build some safety nets, right? And you need to come at this with a bit of structure so that you know how to fine tune it. Eventually, do this enough, and you're going to be able to do this a lot faster without nearly as much forethought, and you can probably eyeball what it takes. At this point, I just use the adversary cards and kind of just grab what I need when I feel like I need it. And I can't even really explain that. That's just intuition that I have built from running the game over and over and over and over, right? So that was method one, which was the slow build, put your pieces into place, and add or remove combatants as necessary. So yeah, that's how that works. Method two, like we said, what you're trying to do instead is you're trying to say the world is the world. It's going to be 5 Aqualish thugs. They're the same group, right? When they're going to mug people, they're not going to use all 10 or 9 of their people, mainly because it's not that effective. And they're used to taking down soft targets, right? If you really think about it, these guys are not interested in getting mixed up with hardcore criminals or hardcore combatants. That's absolutely not in their interest. What they would prefer is a cushy businessman with a lot of money that they can push around and get a bunch of gear and whatever, right? In this case, like we said, they made a complete error of judgment. They probably got a bit too greedy, whatever. But they decided to attack the PCs. But generally speaking, these guys aren't really in for a fight. They don't have to do it. But yeah, so when we're using method 2, we're still using the same 3 questions. And for the most part, we can use the same answers too, right? But the crucial difference here is, when that question asks how many reinforcements can they call, or the question asks what can draw them away, we're asking and answering those questions because in method 1 as a GM, we need to know how we can manipulate the fight, how we can add or remove combatants. Whereas in this case, that's not what we're doing that for at all, right? Our reason for manipulating the fight is not because, oh, it's too easy or it's too hard or it's not cinematic enough, right? Those motivations are completely counterintuitive, and I'll talk about in a minute that like they're very bad. They will lead to bad practices, which we'll cover in a second. Instead, the reason for these NPCs to call in the reinforcements has to come from PCs and PC actions. Likewise, the reason for the NPCs to decide to skedaddle is also coming from PC actions. That's how you want to use the answers that you've made to those questions, right? So like I said, the reason to call in reinforcements, it's going to be because the PCs did something or gave the NPCs an opportunity to get onto the radio and squawk for help, right? Likewise, the reason for police to come in and end the fight early is because the PCs realized, ooh, this is a bit more too dangerous for us, and they found a way to call for help. They called the police themselves. They ran into the kitchen and got the staff to call for help. And like we said, these thugs are not into dealing with the police. It's easier for them to vanish and find a new target, right? So it's a subtle distinction, but it is an important one. And I'll dig into this now. The reason it's important is because the crucial thing that we're trying to accomplish with method 2 is we want everyone to have the same expectations, and we want everyone to be on the same page. If you are using GM fiat reasons for adding in more reinforcements or taking away NPCs, it won't make sense. The PCs won't be able to diagnose why these things happened, right? Because the reason you're doing them is for completely non-fictional reasons. You're doing them because you, the GM, don't think the fight is hard enough. You're doing it because you, the GM, think the fight is not cinematic enough, whatever, right? But as players, they won't be able to judge their surroundings or their situation accurately, and that makes method two fall apart entirely. Because if they can't judge what they're getting into, then you might as well not use that system because they will get obliterated because they just don't understand their environment because there are no consistent rules to play by. So instead, if you focus on adding reinforcements or withdrawing troops based entirely on fictional concerns, the next question that you have to answer is how the hell could the players even know that? And that's when we get back to the telegraphing, right? The PCs cannot make use of these things, of these options, unless you, the GM, indicate to them that they are options, right? And this feeds back into what we have been doing, which is the environments and the objectives, right? The environment is going to tell them that, hey, there is a kitchen staff here, and they might be able to call for help for you, right? As we've already established, our environment already has some of these features. They have the highlights that I said we're going to save for later, which is the spray tags for the cat hounds. And they have a feature, which is the kitchen, the busy restaurant kitchen, right? Your job is to use those things that you have set up to indicate to the players, here are your options in this fight. Here's what is going down. They're being mugged. They understand that. You need to help them understand that. And then afterwards, you also need to help them understand what their choices are, right? So to take our example, we have one highlight that we talked about, which is the spray paint tag for the cat hound gang, right? The way to leverage that highlight into explaining to your players what their options are is all the way from the spaceport to the fight location. You let them slowly see and learn this critical piece of environmental detail, right? Let them spot that there are these tags. In fact, let them spot it without rolling at all, right? As they're just walking across the street, highlight it to one or two PCs. If you have one who's particularly good at perception, just tell them that they see it first, right? It doesn't really matter. But what is important is that they see it. Secondly, they can't just see it, but they need to have some understanding of it. And again, I would do this without rolling. Without rolling, have somebody see it, and maybe somebody else who has a bit more like street knowledge, have them see it as well. And tell both of them or one of them, but make sure that the party understands. They're like, hey, this is a gang's tag. This is used by low-level street gangs to mark their territory. You are completely aware of this. You're walking into a gang's territory. Now, if they're interested in rolling something, let them make Knowledge Underworld or Streetwise rolls. And with their success, then they can learn more about the gang. They can learn that they are a very small street gang. They can learn that maybe their headquarters are close by, right? But those Knowledge Underworld, those Streetwise rolls, they should not be used to gatekeep the very critical information that they are being led into gang territory. That is something the players must understand before they get into the fight proper. Once they are there, right, the next thing that we need to, that piece of information, I should say, is really to let them know that this is gang territory. They are in the enemy's hive, right? So that the players can understand it's possible once this fight makes itself apparent that these guys could call reinforcements, right? That's what you're trying to do with that piece of information. And by the way, the first couple times, if they don't fully understand this, once you get to the actual fight and you roll initiative, break fiction and let them know, because your first couple times out, it's probably new for them and it might be new for you. So you want to just let them fully understand, like, hey, remember all these things I said? That is why. I was saying it all so that you understand you're in the heart of gang territory. They might be able to call reinforcements, act accordingly. Right, okay. So how does the restaurant help us? Well, once they get to the location of the fight, first of all, make sure that they pass by the restaurant itself and they can see that it's in operation. They can see that the staff there's busboys going around, there are people eating on the inside, there's maybe somebody waiting for takeout, whatever. What you need to convey to them at this point is two things. One, this is a busy restaurant, thereby somehow usable by them. Two, it is not gang affiliated. If you leave even half a suspicion that there's something hinky happening in this kitchen, they're going to take that and run with it in a very different way than you expected, right? Which is fine. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is somewhat at cross purposes because we're trying to indicate to them, again, is that this restaurant may be a way for you guys to get some reprieve, right? You might be able to run in and be like, oh my God, they're shooting, and get them to call the police or something, right? But what you want to at least express to them is it is nominally safe until the players do something to make themselves unwelcome in the restaurant. It is at least a somewhat safe place run purely by civilians, right? let's see. We fix the opposition insofar as a GM in facing this particular predicament, we know how we can escalate or de-escalate things using either methodology, right? And we fix the environment. I think the last thing to do, yeah, is fix the objective. So to begin with, if you are doing these things like showing them that they're walking into gang territory and this guy is a little fidgety, he's leading them to an alleyway, it's entirely possible that the players might be like, hey, this feels like a trap. And and that's totally cool. Reward that. Don't fight it, you know? It's totally fine. They figured it out. Good on them, right? A lot of times GMs will panic when when something like this is revealed. They'll be like, "Oh shit, I didn't have my grand reveal moment." That's not as cool as you think. First of all, secondly, it will be like infinitely more interesting to the players if you're like, "Shit, you guys figured it out. Good job," and you alter the situation. So how can you alter the situation? Well, think of it this way. Um, there was a mini challenge here of them recognizing that this guy was a dirtbag and leading them into a trap, and they solved it. They solved it without getting into it. So what can you reward them with? Well, one, they could just not have the fight, right? They could just say, yeah, cool. We're not going to do this guy because we got places to be, and we thought the person who was going to sell us this gear you promised was closer. We're going to bounce, and they leave. Great, good for them. That could be one thing, right? Or the alternative could be they say all those same things, but the thugs are desperate and they're like, oh, screw this noise. And they decide to attack the players right then and there, right? Make that an option, but make it not an overwhelming option because this is supposed to be a reward, right? So in this case, what the players are really getting is they get the choice of you can just bounce and they won't deal with you, or you can try and leave and recognize that they're going to fight you right here on the streets in an entirely unadvantageous situation for the NPCs, and it'll basically be a more straight-on fight, right? It'll be less to the NPCs' advantage and probably let the PCs rip through them much more easily. So that's the way I would treat that just particular mini scenario, because I know plenty of people would be like, well, obviously the players would recognize it's a trap, and that's totally fine. That's not a bad thing. All that does is make their characters more badass, so why not, right? All I'm saying is just change the context. If you really need this fight to go down, cool. It's happening in the streets rather than in the alleyway. No one can mistake that these psychopaths are trying to attack the player characters in broad daylight. The reward is just an uncomplicated moment where they get to just trounce some bad guys for fun. No problem. But if for whatever reason the players go along with what you got, maybe they're just very considerate and they saw the trap, but they're like, nah, dog, I'm going to play this out and see what you have in store for us. That's very nice of them. But it doesn't solve the fact that our objective is pretty trash. It's still, at the moment, escape or kill, which, like we talked, is kind of the same thing, right? But we've added a lot more details that can help kind of fix what we have going on. For one, I like to, like I said, use all the parts of the buffalo, so fall back on all the things that we have been using to see if there is something that we can mine for a better objective, right? So I came up with 2 of them. You could probably come up with others, but we have our default implicit objective of kill the bad guys to escape, which is fine. And depending on the kind of players or characters at the table, we could have one objective, which is to win some hero status. And how does that make sense? Well, looking to the restaurant that's there, right? We have a restaurant that's full of civvies, and they're just trying to live their day. They're just trying to get some food, do whatever they do. And if you think about it from their perspective, there is a group of 4 out-of-town weirdos, probably dressed bizarrely, exotically, carrying exotic weaponry, that kind of stuff, all look battle-hardened or capable in some capacity, and they're just roaming the streets, right? That tends to catch the notice of anybody, right? Like it's a pack of weirdos roaming the streets being led by this guy, right? So what you're trying to do, like what I'm proposing, is these guys fighting in the street will mean something for the local neighborhood, right? Which will change the notion of are they going to win the fight into how do they win the fight? Because everybody is watching. Everybody, it's a tight-knit neighborhood, and they see these crazy weirdos walking into town, And this is like a gunslinger moment. Like, who are these people? What are they capable of? When push comes to shove, how are they going to deal with it? Right? If they again show John Wick brutality and ferocity, they're going to be written off as another evil organization, as another just gang roaming the streets. People are not going to want to deal with them. They're going to be terrified of them, and they're going to try their best not to deal with it. Alternatively, if the players choose to deal with the situation with some tact, try not to make a huge scene, try and talk this whole situation down, not go for brutal kill shots and stuff like that, they will probably win the trust of the local cities, right? And we are God after all, so we can make that so. Instead of saying they probably will, we can set up the situation such that they will win the trust of the citizens. How do you convey all this? Like I said, treat it like a Western, you know? Out of towners coming into town, have everybody watch from the windows and have people, like turn a corner, see the PCs, freak out and walk away, right? Like, use the environment, use the people, use the neighborhood to convey the fact that there's a lot of violence that happens here, so they're very wary of newcomers, and especially give it that Western vibe of like people are watching what's happening, but they're trying to look like they're not watching, right? So yeah, all you're trying to convey there is that this town has seen quite a lot. The NPCs have seen quite a lot, and they are wondering what you're going to do. And this is somewhat oblique, right? This whole notion is somewhat oblique. So I would very explicitly convey to the players, like, hey, there's a X person watching you, right? And they're very curious how this whole fight is going down, or there's a crowd that has gathered and they're trying to see how this thing is going down, but they're peering from around corners and stuff like that. And again, break fiction if you need to, and just let them know, like, your characters would understand that, like, how you choose to execute this fight is going to say a lot about you to the eyes of the local populace. So if you care about that, you may want to be careful in how you choose to engage this fight. But of course, as I just said, this is very oblique. And like we talked about, a good objective has to meet the player characters halfway. The choices have to matter to the player characters. If no one in the party really cares about that, right? They don't even have to be murder hobo or whatever. They may be on a planet that they're not too interested in. They're going to leave tomorrow or the day after. So if they don't really care so much about winning hearts and minds, this is the bad objective. It's not going to help. It's not going to do or add anything to it, right? You as a GM may not know what makes sense for your player characters in the beginning. That's okay. You're going to figure it out over time, right? You're going to do something like throw this particular idea down and realize they gave no shits whatsoever. They just blitzed right through the enemy. When you were like, oh, the local populace is scared of you, they're like, I don't care. We're leaving tomorrow, so they can be as scared as they want. Like, if you see that that's the kind of crew that you're dealing with, fine. You tried a thing, it didn't quite work out. You can reassess and do something different next time, right? But if you are aware a bit of your party's proclivities, the other way you could frame this is lean into their aspirations in the underworld. I call this objective find the big fish. So we've already said that the NPC thugs that are trying to harangue our PCs are a small gang, just local street toughs, right? We can make the assumption or assertion that they are connected to the underworld somehow. And if your PCs care about making a connection with the underworld, this is a great opportunity. Convey to them that, hey, you could rip through these guys, but you also recognize that these guys are not terribly connected, but just connected enough to help you, eat your way up the food chain, right? So how do you convey it? Well, first, make sure that they understand that they're small-time street thugs, right? So make them look the part, make them look ratty and malnourished. And again, just come out and say it to somebody who has this kind of experience, like, hey, these guys look like small-time street thugs to you. Next, have the NPC who's guiding them into this trap talk about, like, he's trying to sell, quote unquote, sell some gear to the PCs, right? So have him talk about a particular name drop, a particular NPC that might help. And then let a player know that that name drop person is somebody of substance, or maybe have them roll to figure that out. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is they name drop somebody that is clearly, obviously of higher criminal standing, right? And last but not least, if none of these things work or really lay it lay the message out to the players before you break fiction and tell them to run really heavy-handed move. In this case, I said just let them hear the other end of a comm call from somebody that is basically threatening these punks, being like, "Hey, you got to turn in your loot. You know, you got to kick up to the boss. Otherwise, I'm going to send my thug to collect." Right? And then at that point, let the PCs know that it sounds like somebody higher up the food chain is, trying to get these guys to work to the deadline, right? So the point is to take these in stages, build on it. If it doesn't click into place, or you feel like it hasn't clicked into place, when they're rolling initiative again, break fiction and let them know, okay, here's what's happening, right? Just in case you guys didn't understand, here is what is going on. These guys are a small time street, and you guys have said you're looking for a way into it. This might be a good way, right? So, kind of covering all that, just going back over it really quickly. The reason our new objectives work is something that we should investigate. Like, why do they matter? Because in some cases they will matter, in some cases they don't, right? So if we're taking the new objective of gaining some hero status, the choice that we're presenting to the players is be brutal and efficient and get through this very quickly, or handle the encounter with tact and subtlety, right? The idea in this case is if they're being too brutal, they get marked as another gang, or maybe a new gang, and bad dudes are trying to target them because they're a new gang trying to eat up the status ladder as far as they're concerned, and the regular populace think they're just another criminal element, so they're not likely to host or talk to them, right? On the other side of that, if the players do prove their hero status, then let the local populace fawn over them, like really suck their dick in this moment is what I'm trying to say. Like let them really really get into it. They're like, oh my God, you're the first crew who's not just taken a new place in street crime. Like you're actually seems like you're trying to do something different. Please God help us, And it shouldn't just be these NPCs feeding off of them, but also the NPCs should help them out. Give them a place to lay low. They just killed a small street gang. Have one guy come in and be like, hey, dude, come here. We're going to deal with the cops, but you guys got to get off the streets. I got a place for you to hide. And like that kind of stuff. Make sure that they get some sort of payout from it, and also that they see that there's a new situation at play, right? These people believe in the player characters, and maybe they're looking for help, and maybe they're offering aid, right? Looking at the other one, which is finding the big fish. Their choice in that case was to escape and kill or capture a valuable target, right? The failure is obvious. If they didn't capture a valuable target, they just did the standard kill thing. They might have pissed somebody off. Doesn't really matter. Point being, they kill their way out. And the street, it's kind of similar to if the players were too brutal in the other one. The street knows that there's some new players out there. However, if they successfully capture a target that might have information, that one is obvious too, right? They learn some stuff about the underworld. They find new ways into wherever they're going for. Point being, if we break it down this way, we can see what the choices are, and then it's easier to spot, is this relevant for my player characters? So that is all I got. That was way longer than I thought it would be, and I apologize for that. But I do have a number of what am I called combat prompts that we can run through. I knew I wasn't going to get through all of them. I'm just probably going to roll and see what comes up randomly. But yeah. So we have, I guess this comes from Rise Against, right? So Rise, if you want to talk about this, is cool. But I got your little combat prompt here, which is a small building like a cantina, but with separate rooms where doors can be shut, using relative range band distances for multiple people, NPCs, moving ranges between each PC and the minion group, right? And when asked what particularly they wanted to focus on with this, Rise said, I struggle with closing doors or walking through doorways, even if they're within a given range like short or medium. Once they pass a door's threshold, players don't see why they can't hit the enemy, even though they're technically in range. When players and NPCs use maneuvers to get to certain points like behind a wall or up a ledge, the players have difficulty grasping that while something may still be in short range, it would be an extra maneuver to get to the other point. Also, confusion sometimes arises when people spread out and change range bands relative to each other. Okay. I think in general, the question is interesting because it's talking about using range bands and stuff like that. A couple things. One, you can use the range bands listed: short, medium, long, extreme, right? And you can use them exactly how they're listed, and they will work perfectly fine, right? However, there's a thing that you could attempt to do, which I think can make things more unusual and interesting, is to just say, well, short range is usually, I don't know, let's say a city block, but we're in an enclosed office space building type situation, right? There's a bunch of cubicles all around. For the context of this fight, I'm going to redefine what short range, medium range, long range, etc. means, right? That's a weird little trick that you can use to kind of indicate that the environment is very weird to traverse, that kind of thing. To some extent, it's kind of like imposing difficult terrain for everybody. So it is something you want to be careful implementing when you have characters who have talents like Swift and stuff that let them ignore difficult terrain, right? So, but it's a thing that you can do to indicate the weirdness of an environmental space, which can help with the situation of what he's talking about, where the range band distances don't make sense to people, why you can't hit a guy who's just around a corner, that sort of thing, right? So, yeah, I think there's more play in the range band system than people realize. And you can get a lot more out of it if you're not afraid to recontextualize what short, medium, long, et cetera means, right? And there's nothing to say you can't change that on the fly in the combat as long as players fully understand what is happening, right? You have to be very clear with them, like, okay, guys, this is going to be short range in this encounter, right? So here's what it's going to look like so that you know how far you can get from place to place, et cetera. The other thing about actually shooting people when they've gone around doors if you're still in short range, I actually kind of disagree with his premise there. You can totally do that. Like, if you are still within short range of somebody else and all they did was take cover behind a doorway, you could spend your turn moving to shoot them, that kind of thing. There is enough like flexibility, I guess, in the range system to do that. So it's not uncouth, I guess.
I see that Weapon Rank had sent me a combat encounter. His encounter was that the party must infiltrate a Star Destroyer and slice into its command computer. Stormtroopers will essentially never stop coming until the party escapes. The Inquisitor is also after them, but they aren't supposed to die here. It took me a second to understand this, but from what I get, Weapon Rank, what you mean is the Inquisitor is not supposed to die. This is kind of a, here's the bad guy, he's a douchebag moment, right? Just showing the players that this guy's here. Okay, cool. And then just so everybody else is clear, when asked what particular part of the encounter he struggled with to make better, I don't know if it's he actually, Weapon Rank said, I'm not very good at having enemies survive fights with PCs without horribly overtuning them. Cool. So that's a fair problem, right? There's lots of little things that you can do. First of all, to just have a particular, if there's a particular NPC that is supposed to survive, there are a lot of different ways you can get them out of dodge, right? One, however, I would question the purpose of them physically being there, right? One of the best, villain reveals was Emperor Palpatine on a holoprojector, right? It was menacing, but no way anyone could do anything about it if they ever caught one of those transmissions, right? So I would consider doing something like that. The Inquisitors somewhere, maybe in their meditation chamber, right? And they hollow in being like, what the hell is happening on this bridge, right? And they start sending people, right? That's one thing you can do. However, if you need them there, that's fine. We can work with that too. You have a situation that is effectively a defend against a horde, is kind of the way I read this, is they got to get in, they slice into the command computer, and whenever the jig is up and they raise enough alarm, that's when you have waves of endless stormtroopers being led by an Inquisitor, and they got to do their thing and get out of dodge. A couple ways you can just structure this whole thing to begin with. One, you can make it as a skill challenge, which is pretty easy. It depends on whether or not you want to do that kind of thing. The general conceit with this skill challenge, I would say, is you want to decide if no matter what, they're always going to make it to the command computer, or if they can fail the challenge such that they will be stuck somewhere in the Star Destroyer, and they got to figure out if they're going to continue to try and complete their objective or escape, right? So that's the first decision you have to make. Once you decide whether or not they can get to the command console or not, still, if you're assuming you're doing a skill challenge, you just decide how difficult you think it might be for them, right? Like your simple concept is they need X number of successes. before X number of failures or failed checks to get to complete the skill challenge, right? So if you have 4 PCs, I don't know, maybe they need 4 successes uh, before 4 failed checks. And you're not necessarily counting how many successes they get, but you're saying they need 4 successful checks to get to the final console. Last but not least, for doing a skill challenge, the easiest way is to say, hey, it has to be skills that you have ranks in. Um, and you can't repeat the same skill somebody else chose, and slowly work your either you can slowly work your way through the narrative and be like, okay, you get to X point, there is this obstacle, who's going to step up and figure out how they deal with it. Okay, great, you dealt with it this way, now we move on to this obstacle, who steps up to deal with it next, that kind of thing. The other way to do it is you can have them, if they already have like an infiltration plan, you have them, you divvy that infiltration plan up into points, which are basically points where you're going to make skill checks, and then you have them decide who's making the skill check at which point, and they do that. And based on how they deal with that, you guys do a montage narration of them slipping in and trying to do that. All of which to say that gets you to the point of doing the slicing and them dealing with the waves and waves and waves, right? Now, I would say the Inquisitor, if you're worried that they're going to get obliterated, I would use them as a more tactical commander, right? Have them do shit and be relevant that they're doing shit outside of where the players are entrenched, right? Like, there's no need for the Inquisitor to try and go in on his lonesome, but the easiest way to make him seem like a real threat is to have them hear him over the intercom being like, you guys need to get the hell out of here. You need to surrender, this is going to be very bad for you, while launching weird sneak attacks coming in through bulkheads, coming in through like repair corridors and stuff like that, right? Like, let them understand that this guy is directing all these forces, and then have him show up at the absolute height of the enemy's superiority. Once the enemy has sprung its trap on on the PC's entrenched point, that's when the Inquisitor comes in under full protection of his squad, screws the PCs up as much as he can. But yeah, your best bet here is then to flip a dark side point to have him escape, or use some GM fuckery to have him escape. And be clear, when you do this, make sure you reward the players, right? Like, if you're having him escape specifically because the players are getting close to killing him, flip some dark side to make it happen. If you're not flipping dark side, right, have him escape, but have him face a consequence for escaping, right? Like, he has to leave behind something valuable in order to escape, that sort of thing. So the players understand, yes, this guy escaped, but you didn't get nothing out of it, right? In order for me to have this guy escape unfairly, I am rewarding you with this thing that is pretty cool, right? That he had to leave behind for it. Um, that would be the way I would do that, I guess. There are other ways to do it, but really what I'm advocating is keep that high value enemy at a distance, deploy them very tactically, and remove them quickly. More often than not, people attempt to escape long after they should have. So if you want him to live, have him get a couple shots, very decent, devastating shots, and then peace out, because he recognizes early on, these guys are near unstoppable. I'm getting out of here to report back. I hope that answered that.
Darth, I see you requested to speak. I don't know if you did that recently, but I'm going to go ahead and admit you to the front, to the stage, to ask whatever question you might have.
Yeah, hello. I just have something to ask about the tension. How do you add the players' tension enough to make them feel like they have to recover, but not enough to make them just fall down in every combat? Because sometimes we in our party just go for, well, this is one disadvantage, well, you just got one of tension, this is advantage, well, you have one tension less. It's sometimes in my party works like this, and I would like to know how to improve it to make my players know that they are overwhelmed, for example. So, well, it's just this.
So, to make sure I understand you clearly, you mean both in the fiction to make them understand that, like, hey, there are too many Imperials for you to successfully just take them head on.
More or less, it's more like how to put the tension system, how to make the system of detention work
Okay. So more specifically, strain then is what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No worries, man. Um, strain is a tricky little beast, right? To some extent, it is out of your hands because the players do kind of need to be aware of when they're reaching their limits. So it's there is what I'm trying to say is there's a barrier that you're never really going to be able to get past, which is they have to be aware of how close they are to their strain. But there are some things that you can do to help them out, right? For one, like you said, when they roll up advantage, I tend to always, because I am obsessive, keep track of what's happening with their sheets and their stats, so that if somebody is verging close towards their strain threshold, I will politely say, hey, you might be able to clear some strain, which is really me saying like, yo, dude, look at your sheet. You're getting pretty high up on strain. You probably want to clear that down somewhat, right? Likewise, um, I'll tell you a little secret. One of the things I hate is using the table for advantage and threat for the players, right? For the GM, it's a godsend to know how much threat or advantage is useful to do whatever you're trying to do. But I usually tell the players, even if they know the system very well, I tell them, do not tell me if you're passing a boost or if you're um, trying to force a maneuver out of your opponent. I don't want that. Give me a narrative that is cool of what you do. Likewise, I try to give them a narrative of what the threat might be, but the intent is for them, by expressing everything in terms of what is happening in the fiction, you as the GM can then levy the bonuses or penalties appropriately. And obviously the bonuses, you still want to ask them, hey, you said this. Am I to take that to mean that you're going to pass a boost to X person, right? You just want to confirm what it is that they were trying to get out of their advantage spends. But for the way this helps you as a GM is you can avoid inflicting strain on them too much, right? The way I tend to treat when threat comes up, one of the basic options is to inflict strain on the PCs. I tend to avoid that as much as possible because they're going to be doing a lot of stuff to build their own strain, right? Activating talents and taking extra maneuvers and stuff like that. So I always, in my priority list, I say that inflicting strain is going to be the very last option that I look at when I'm truly out of ideas of what I can say in the narrative or say in the fiction before I inflict some sort of penalty, right? So I am far more prone to throwing setback on them. I think that's a better option. And like I said, if you just can't think of anything, then yeah, just make them take a point or two of strain.
Right. Thank you.
Yep. 60, you asked something about fear checks. I just saw it. I'll just read this out loud. Can you maybe speak to how fear checks might factor into the second method? It seems like there are a lot more ways to use the fear checks than most people do. Thanks. Okay, sure. Fear checks are great. They are very useful for the second method of treating the world as the world. Here's a very unconsidered example, right? You have players that are trying to infiltrate a scoundrel's hideout. They get inside. It's a Jabba type cantina situation. There's a bunch of ne'er-do-wells. There are people smoking and drinking in this cantina. But what you want them to know, what you want them to understand, is that there are some Imperials in disguise, right? For whatever reason, they've already known that Imperials are interested and around. You want them to understand that there are Imperials in disguise here. There's two ways you could do that. One is you could just straight up tell them, which is totally fine. And in reality, I would, if you don't want to do the fear check option, I would absolutely just straight up tell them. But two, the more devious method is you have them all roll a fear check, right? And it doesn't have to be much. It could be like a 1 diff or a 2 diff fear check, something that maybe drops a setback on them if they fail, or maybe inflicts a strain or two. But regardless, the secret here is regardless of the result of the fear check, what you're actually doing is you're using it as a delivery vehicle to tell them, hey guys, there's some Imperials in hiding here. This operation that you were going to run is now gotten a lot more dangerous because there's Imperial scrutiny at play, right? So the kind of thing that you want to do with the fear check it doesn't even have to mean that you're, because I think a lot of people can also be resistant to fear checks because they think it makes their character be somebody else than they envisioned. And that's not the case. What you want to explain to them is, hey, this fear check is really just your warrior senses pinging, right? You, the player, you can play this however you want, right? Your character does not have to be afraid, but deep down inside, they must understand that, like, oh shit, there's something very real and there's something very dangerous here at play, right? They could be such a grizzled veteran that it doesn't cause their hand to shake or whatever, but internally, their warrior senses are on alert, their adrenaline is running, and here we go, right? Like, so that's what you help them understand, that that's what the fear check is about. How they choose to play that shouldn't change the way they want to play their character, right?
It
All
looks
right,
like
so,
we just actually did get a question from Sherbniz.
All right.
My question was a bit about triumph use and power creep. We have a really old session that's around session 160 or so. Wow. In the beginning, when we didn't really know the system very well and triumphs were very rare, and we always made sure to make their effect grand and interesting, but now that some of them toss around with a big bunch of proficiency dice, they've started to become rather plentiful, and I'm a bit of a pinch.
Okay, that's a great question. That question speaks to an interesting dilemma of just high-powered characters to begin with, right? So the not good or the not feel good answer to that question is very honestly tell your players, like, hey y'all, maybe we need to recontextualize what a triumph means, because you guys are now gods among men. So maybe we should recontextualize what it means to get a triumph and change it from it's from your question. It sounds like they were rather spectacular. And since they're coming up so often, you're trying to tame them down a little bit so that when you get double triumphs or triple triumphs, then it means something else, right? So assuming that is where you're coming from, yeah, I would be very honest and just be like, hey guys, we probably need to reassess what a triumph means for our game in the context of our game, and maybe tone them down a little bit so they are not as expansive as they used to be. Obviously, what you would have liked to have done, but you clearly couldn't because it was your first time running the game or you were new to the game, is you want to kind of set a tone for triumphs. But the setting a tone for triumphs is endemic to all games, is setting the tone for your game, right? Triumphs and successes, but triumphs and advantages, honestly, more so, really do change the nature and tone of your game. If you started making if you started out with advantages and triumphs having a large degree of narrative latitude, you're generally going to end up with a game that is very bombastic and high flying. That's not bad, but that tends to be the outcome. Likewise, if you really want to kind of make the game a bit grittier and slowly elevate to that higher bombastic level, your first job is to make sure that advantages and triumphs have a bit more of a grounded feel to them. Like, they do something interesting and exciting, but they don't go overboard. Generally speaking, my tact has always been to tell them, I don't want to hear what mechanical thing you're doing with this. I want to hear how you change the narrative in an awesome way, right? And I have generally said, hey guys, triumphs are basically critical successes, but in this case, they actually just do something truly awesome, but not necessarily related to what you're after. And advantage is just something badass you happen to do because you're a badass and you just happen to do badass things all the time, right? So that's kind of how I try and structure it in my players' heads. But when you get to the point that you are at, I would say, honestly, the best advice I can give you is make it a group discussion. Let the players know this is the deal. They should be sympathetic, right? Like, and be very clear that, like, this is a GM problem. It's a issue of, like, some people don't know what to do with a high-powered game. That's totally fine. I came from a background of White Wolf games, which are just bonkers in their power level to start. So for me, that's a bit more comfortable. I'm okay doing high-powered things. The other way I could answer your question is this. Once the game gets to a level of high power, you can stop worrying about whether or not they will accomplish a thing and instead change your focus to be not just how they choose to accomplish it, but why they're involved in the things that they are involved in, and let the triumphs and the advantages speak to that. Tell them, like, look, I know that you can shred through a gang of stormtroopers, no problem. That's not really the interesting part anymore. We're not so much concerned, can you kill these guys? Instead, we're more concerned with why are you choosing to do it? Why are you engaging in this fight? How are you going to do it? Are you going to blitz them all down? Are you going to be John Wick in your brutality and efficiency? Or are you going to do something even crazier insofar as go for all non-lethal shots, but you're such a good shot that they are just all non-lethal, right? So that kind of thing, like change the trajectory of how you're answering these questions. And to help you, you can then use the triumphs and the advantages to do that. That helps with the triumphs being too powerful kind of issue. So hopefully that helped. I don't think I have a great answer to your question because your situation is a bit unique. I would either change, like I said, what the game is about is no longer can you do this, but why you choose to do it. Or I would talk to them and be like, hey guys, we need to kind of reset on what we think a triumph means for us. Okay, so the question is, how do you handle players splitting up to accomplish both objectives, right? In this case, I think a lot of people are worried with splitting the party because of the old adage of don't split the party. But for one, Star Wars makes it really good to split the party. Most player characters are actually a lot more capable than you would expect, right? And the dice are a little swingy enough that they actually have better odds than you would think of doing stuff when they're split up. But when they do split up, the first thing I would say is don't panic. It's totally fine. They want to try and accomplish both objectives at once, no problem. Your job then is to just cycle between both parties quickly, right? What you want to do in that case when they're going to split up is you're going to establish kind of parameters. Okay, Jerry and Tom are going to go after the hostages. Sarah and Tina are going to go after the bad guys, right? So you know where your split is. You cut to the temptation is to cut to what is the highest action at first. But I would actually advise the opposite. I would say, if, for instance, you know the bad guys are right there, and Sarah and Tina are going to be able to just jump right into a crazy firefight, cut to whoever the fuck I said the other guys were, Timmy and Tommy, whatever. Cut to those guys trying to deal with the hostages, because what you really want to do is you want to get them to the point where, okay, they're trying to save hostages, and you escalate the tension of that scene before you cut over to the other guys who are already at a high action moment. This is outside the scope of really how to design combats, but just, I guess that's my little tip, is try and get each group to high action before you cut every time, and just be fast about it. Don't let them linger. When you put a challenge like this in front of them, you want to make them feel that pressure of time, right?
Can we get a make vehicle combat interesting version of this, Luzelli?
Sure. That is a super expansive question.
Might be worth a workshop, a separate workshop.
I think so. But I will say, truthfully, you can apply all this to making vehicle combat interesting, right? It's the same principle of what is the objective. Instead of blitz your way through opposing ships, give it a real objective. Take something, implant something, protect something, right? Stick to those. Give it a distinct objective beyond just blowing their way through it. Secondly, space combat, all combat is better with a dynamic environment at play, right? Especially with space, three-dimensionality is something I think people forget because there's so many different levers and wheels to keep track of because of the way space combat is run. I would be even more explicit in space combat and very much put things in different planes of space that are interesting and that are features for the environment, right? Like, it's one thing to say that it's happening in an asteroid field. That's very common for Star Wars, very cool, no doubt. But why not have, if you're into the new canon stuff, why not have a fleet of Purrgil that just happened to be roaming at the time, right? Why not have, basically what I'm saying is, why not have bizarre, random, interesting celestial events happening, And that's one way that you can add to the environment of it. But I would say still, as far as space combat works, it's the same general principles. You want to make sure your objectives are tight. You want to make sure that your environment has lots of different things that can be played with. And you want to make sure that your NPC opposition makes sense and that there are ways to add or subtract, right? Because no fight is ever perfectly tuned. It's just, sometimes you got to add a couple guys, sometimes you got to drop them. Just depends on why you're doing that.
Flint
Let's
just
see,
prompted a
Flint.
question. Yeah. Do you have any tips on how to make bleak environments like a forest or swamp more interesting? Cityscapes come relatively easy for me. Nature, not so much.
Okay. A lot of this is in the eye of the beholder. Like I know parts that I am relatively weak at, right? Like honestly, space terrains are a bit more of a struggle for me, right?
Yeah,
That's just
space by the
I'm not
nature of being space.
that, and truthfully, I'm not terribly interested in spaceship combat. I'm more interested in planetary vehicle combat. So like I can just picture those environments more easily, more readily, right? But that having been said, I guess what I can do is I could say, here's how to deal with an environment that you're not good at, right? That's probably a more applicable way of dealing with this, rather than just say, here's what you can do for forests or swamps or whatever. Pinterest, Google, right? Look up places that you are not good at. When I'm trying to do a space combat, I just spend some time just browsing through random artists' interpretation of space combats and stuff like that, and look for things to steal, or interpretations of space anomalies and look for things to steal. Likewise, for you, specifically for the environments that you are not terribly good at coming up with things for, I would use visual medium that can help you, that can suggest, because there's going to be somebody else who's way more interested in it, who spend their lifetime painting, insane RPG terrains, right? And so they will have, they will breathe it into that artwork, and if you pay attention, you're going to catch it, right? The other thing to think about if you're struggling with an environment that you don't have a lot of familiarity with is sometimes what I like to do is to break that environment down into particular pieces. I think somebody mentioned that well, I'll go with yours. You said a forest or a swamp more interesting, right? You get a swamp, you know that means that there's green life around, there's stagnant pools of water, and let's just say that's where you're at, right? It's green with vegetation and there's stagnant pools of water. Fine, that's a good starting place. I would take each of those things I just said and dig deep and see what else you can put into it. Okay, stagnant pools of water, what can I do with this, right? Maybe there's something in some of these pools that are going to bite you. They're not going to eat you, but they're going to bite you. And maybe they're not going to do much but inflict strain, but over time that will be frustrating, right? Okay, stagnant pools of water plus vegetation means that it's probably muddy, means it's probably tough going in that environment. You see what I'm saying? Just, it doesn't matter how low resolution your image of this place is, break it down into whatever components you can, and then drill deep into them to try and figure out what else you could add into it. That would be the methodology, I would say, for bringing those environments to light. Once you have done that, then go back and start thinking about what you can add. So you've mined the core premise for as much as you are capable of doing. Now get weird with it and think about what, like the swamp. Okay, let me add some verticality. Well, maybe there's some fallen trees and stuff that make like a Tarzanish space. Maybe this isn't necessarily a swamp, but who cares, right? It's your swamp. So make it Tarzan-y, so there's lots of vines and fallen trees and things to climb and move over, that kind of stuff, right? Maybe there is all this random stagnant pools of water, but then there's one gigantic, almost lake-like entity that is in the center of this, and that can be a underground surface that can be explored. That sort of thing. That's the best I can tell you with environments that you're not good at. Is look at what other people who care about that thing do, and break it down into whatever pieces you got, and then slowly try and mine them for all they're worth.
We just got another question from Dimension 7. Do you have any tips or suggestions for unique things that could be done with quote-unquote dream combat encounters for PCs? I have a nemesis that can use a form of force fear to create environments that the PCs fear. Any tips on how to do damage or make these have an objective as mentioned?
Cool. I love trippy visions. So I guess first things first, what I would have you answer the question really is what you want to gain from this encounter. What does it mean for your story? Right? This is not something you necessarily have to say here, but I'm saying when you're thinking about setting it up, especially if you're thinking about what the objective is. If your game is a movie, what is the narrative beat here? You know, the definitely the nemesis is causing the PCs to become aware of their power and is doing something terrible to them. Great, awesome. What narrative beat is this going to hit for the characters? If you don't have an answer to that, find one. Find something that those characters care about, because once you really dig into like how can I make this part of somebody's narrative arc or something like that, that will reveal an objective that matters, right? To take a bad example, if somebody is haunted by their failure to protect their Jedi master when they were a Padawan and Order 66 happened, and this guy starts doing some fear dreams to them, the objective could be to reconcile that past failing, right? That would be a more interesting objective than defeating him. And once you do that, you can start thinking about what that means for that character, because this will be entirely character dependent, right? So you can start thinking about what does that mean for this guy? What does it mean for him to reconcile? Does it mean for him to realize that he was too fearful at the time, or does it mean for him to understand it's ludicrous for him to think he could have done anything in that moment? Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It's but the point is that you get there by looking at what the narrative purpose of this particular kind of weird encounter is, right? What does it serve for the story of the game overall, right? As for unique things that could be done with dream encounters, dreams are a gigantic Pandora's box. You're not limited to the laws of physics or anything, so you can actually get completely bonkers with it, right? Just don't go too far in the end where players just can't predict anything, right? For an example off the top of my head, maybe they're moving through a city made of just like decommissioned droid parts all cobbled together to be like skyscrapers and buildings and such. And one of them opens a panel of one of these things and they see a coursing silver liquid like flowing through the tubes and whatever of these former droids. As they further on move along, they can see this liquid pouring out like fountains and whatever. They investigate, they touch it with something, and they see that it's corrosive. Cool. All this leads you up to the actual encounter when they fight and they're surrounded by this and shit. They know that there's this coursing corrosive liquid all around them. Maybe they can use that, right? So yes, be weird with the space, do all sorts of wild, crazy things with it. But again, remember that you need to teach them how they can use it.
Just to pipe in as well, I think dreams are a really unique space to use non-combat checks. Because if you look at like movies and television, the character experiencing the dream isn't always fully lucid, right? They're almost buying into the world, and so throw a fear check in, look at the list of skills and throw non-combat stuff to really throw them off their game.
Oh no, you're totally right. That's actually a great point that we didn't really touch on, but we should. Is that the other way to make combats vastly more dynamic and interesting is to leverage lots of non-combat things, right? Oh, when using the environment, like you said, like fear checks. Fear checks are great for changing the scope of the encounter. It becomes there's a source of fear. There's something that is terrifying. The players have to work around that. Another way to do it is involve coordination checks and athletics checks. If you are fighting on unstable ground, involve coordination checks. Just make sure that they understand failure doesn't mean they die. Failure means they get hurt a little bit. They take some strain, they take some wounds, whatever. But that adds a new element to the entire combat, right? It is unstable ground. You know that everybody's going to be taking coordination checks. It will change the entire course of the encounter. And then with that, you start mixing in just trying to kill people, and the whole thing becomes a different ballgame entirely. So yeah, absolutely leverage non-combat checks all the time, as much as you can. Always look to see if there are things that can help.
We just got another question from Galaxy Master. How would you construct a social combat scenario, putting the players in the spotlight of an entirely social setting, be that in the den of an underworld crime lord or perhaps interrogated by the local authorities?
Okay. So basically, this is a thing that is not intended to devolve into combat. There's a misconception about social encounters that they are not the same as combat encounters, and they very much are. They're just the same ideas expressed in a tangential way that you probably don't realize. The easiest way to think about it is go back to core principles of objectives, not just for yourself or for your player characters, I should say, but objectives for the NPCs as well, because that's going to be a critical component of this. So more so even than regular combat, for social encounters of this nature, you need to very well understand the NPCs that are in this scene, right? What do they want to get out of this encounter? What is their motivation, right? You don't need to know their life history, but you do need to know how they feel about the situation at hand, right? So that's the first thing to take really great care with, is understand their perspective and what they want to get out of things. Once you know that, then you know, first of all, you're able to judge whatever the PCs throw into this, right? Like if a hut is very concerned about getting his shipment back to wherever the hell his base is, right? You have to answer the question of why. If the answer for that is because he's already got two strikes against him, and if he doesn't get the shipment back to base, this will be the third strike, then the PCs being like, hey man, we'll buy you off is not going to work, right? Like there's something much greater at stake here than just money. On the other hand, if he's trying to get the shipment from point A to point B entirely for the money, then when the PCs say, hey, we can offer you more money, he'd be more receptive to that. But in order for you to know that, you have to figure out why he's invested in this encounter to begin with. Once you know that like this guy fears for his life, he's not actually making this trade for money, he's making it to like keep his life, then your next job is to figure out how to convey that to the players. Again, it comes down to telegraphing, right? With social scenarios, people tend to be afraid to telegraph as obviously as they would for combat scenarios, but there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? What I would do, if it helps, if you're not used to it, is to write out a list of what are basic elements of this particular encounter that the players must know, right? They like, for instance, if it is absolutely critical for them to understand that this guy fears for his life, and no amount of money is going to budge him in the process, make that a thing that they must know. Doesn't mean that the minute they step into that underworld den, they will know that that's what's going on with this guy, but it is something that you as the GM know that you've got to convey somewhere through the course of this conversation. You have to convey it and make it understood. This is what is really at stake here. This is why this guy is in the situation he's in, right? So what I'm actually advocating for is that in social combats, you want the players to use their roles first to uncover peripheral information about the guy. The actual core problem that he has should be something that they will eventually just figure out with or without a roll. You could give it to them early if they happen to score a triumph or something like that. But point being, that core conflict, he is afraid for his life. That's why he wants to make this shipment happen, is something they're going to get regardless of what happens. The rest of their roles then should be about what kind of other leverage points can they find on this guy? What other things can they do with him, right? Yeah, I kind of sputtered out there because I was trying to think of what else I could relate this to for you.
Galaxy followed up with the question, what do
Yeah,
you
I see that.
do in that case to pull in people that aren't the face of the party?
For one, figure out if you need to. Some players don't mind at all letting this play out and letting the face deal with it, right? I am not a fan of that, but there are people who do that, and, let them play the want to play, which is fine. But if you do have people who are not the face of the party, but they are reticent to get engaged and mixed in and become a part of exchanges like this, right? It's actually really simple and easy. Directly have another NPC ask them some shit, right? Periodically through the course of it, set up your scene. They all step into the smuggler's den. They're going to meet with this guy, set up the scene of where the guy is, where the party is sitting, and what they're doing while this is going down, right? And then periodically, innocently, just ask them, what's his face is talking to this guy? What are the rest of you doing? Really just give them a chance to show like, I'm ordering a drink, or I'm playing solitaire while I listen to this, or I'm watching very intently, whatever the case may be, right? Then, if you have a person that you know you would like to see involved in this, but for whatever reason they're not, even though they probably would enjoy being involved in it, pick an NPC and just have them directly, straight up ask that person a question about what has been said or what is going on, right? Surprisingly, players will dig their grave very quickly with that kind of not prompt, right? Like you're not really doing much but being like, hey man, what do you think? And they will feel like they need to say something profound. And in doing so, they will open up more about that character than they ever intended to. And that will give you an avenue of attack, as it were, to like start making this a complicated, convoluted mess. 'Cause I think,
Any final questions, and we'll
yeah.
wrap up this workshop. But just while we're waiting, thank you so much, Luzelli, for being keen to run this. This was really great, and it's awesome to see, you know, a central perspective on how to run good combat and learn from someone that's been doing it for a while. So yeah, we all
Yeah,
really
my pleasure,
appreciate
man.
it.
It's a lot of fun.
We do have some workshops on the horizon. One that's coming early mid-May. We're working out the fine details of that as we speak. Will be on chases, which is a little bit of a niche subject, but we're excited to kind of dive into it. But yeah, thank you to all of you who attended today. This has been great, and yeah, we appreciate your time.
Thanks for coming, guys. This was a lot of fun. I love gabbing about GM stuff, as Keegan will attest. So thank you for indulging my TED Talk. It was quite a lot of fun. I hope you guys got something out of it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for doing this again. It was great. It really was good. Thanks for coming to the first GM workshop, and we'll catch you at the next one.